Okay, so we're going to turn our attention for this module on how do we go about measuring human rights. So in order to study a particular phenomenon, we have to be able to measure what it is that we're talking about. So just like any other field in political science or social sciences for that matter, we need to differentiate between what is referred to as normative work, which is how we want the world to be, it's our opinions, to empirical work. So if a normative study focuses on how we want the world to be, empirical is non-normative, it's objective rather than subjective. So in a normative study, we have an opinion about what we want the outcome to look like. So for example, we could write a position paper on the university should have more parking on campus. Or we could write a position paper about why all citizens should vote. Or in the human rights field, we can talk about governments should not abuse the rights of citizens. So in all these cases, we can talk about would have, should haves. Empirical work, again, is non-normative. It's objective rather than subjective. So while we might all agree that government should not abuse its citizens, our academic study must be objective. So we want to ask the question, what are the conditions within states that lead to human rights abuses? Just about all human rights scholars that I know think that human rights should be protected. But that's not what they're studying. They're studying what are the conditions within states that lead to human rights abuses. So you have to be able to separate the normative and the subjective from the objective. So we have to consider whether human rights can and should be measured. The previous module covered the various types of human rights, and it should be obvious that no one measure can capture all those different types of rights. So how and should we measure things like political rights? How can we compare country A with country B in terms of the political rights? We have to have some level of measurement. It's just like baking a cake. You have to be able to measure your ingredients. We have to be able to measure whether or not one state's political rights are different than another state's political rights. How do we go about doing that? What about personal integrity rights, things like torture? How do we measure whether or not people are being tortured in a state? And then subsistence rights. How do we measure if someone in a state is having an adequate standard of living? And so this is what the selections in your textbook by Goldstein and Richards are kind of getting at in terms of can we measure and should we measure, and then we'll talk about how and why. So for Goldstein, he tends to address what are some of the problems that we encounter in terms of obtaining reliable human rights data. If we're wanting to measure political phenomenon like voting patterns, we have to look at the underlying data. Where do we go to look at data records or voting records in terms of collecting data? How do we know the income? How do we know the population of states? How do we know this information? We have to have a source. So for a lot of data in American politics, for example, if you're wanting to measure income levels between different states in the United States, we can look at census data. All right, so what is the underlying data, the source of some of this data in the human rights field? Well, Goldstein points out that there's really nothing prior to 1800 in terms of what we would consider to be human rights data. And then there's this idea about what is captured in the West in terms of data availability and what occurs in the non-Western states. If we look at contemporary studies, we can start thinking about demographic data. For a long time, the United States has had the census, so we can look at demographic type of information, the number of people living in cities, how much money they make, how they died. We can look at all that kind of information, and this is true of most Western states. In non-Western states, we have a lot of misrepresentation or a lot of lack of data for developing countries, for example. And then we have social and economic human rights data, looking at things like doctors per 1,000 individuals. In terms of some economic data, we like to know in today's world how many people have access to the internet. And so that kind of data is actually recorded by states. And so we can look at information dissemination, for example. So if we think about the different types of information that's gathered in terms of social and economic data, we tend to think of things like income levels, GDP per capita. We look at population data. We look at literacy rates. We look at health accessibility, we look at arable land, we look at clean water. All these types of demographic data are available depending upon how much the state actually goes about collecting that data. And remember, most of the time when I talk about a state in this class, I'm talking about countries, okay? And then we can look at political and civil rights. How many people are allowed to vote? What are the conditions for voting? What are the requirements for voting in terms of different populations across the globe? And so a lot of this information, it comes from different governments, but there's also non-governmental organizations that engage in data collecting, like Amnesty International. We'll talk a lot about that throughout this module. So where do we get data regarding torture? Most states don't publish the fact that they're torturing people, so how do we get that data and how reliable is it? Then, of course, there's difficulties in interpreting data. How do we compare data across states, for example? So if one country is torturing 100 people and they have a bazillion people like China, or a billion people like China, versus another country that is torturing 100 people but their population is 10 million, what does that say, if anything, about the differences in those countries? And again, we agree torture is not, we should not be torturing people, but we have to compare. So you have to think about per capitizing a lot of this data. Okay, so we're going to talk about an organization called Freedom House. It's an organization that has a website, and they look at political and civil data. There is something called the CIRI dataset, CIRI, that David Richards, the author of one of your reading selections, is a co-investigator on, that gathers data in terms of political rights data, torture data, and so we'll take a look at those. Okay, and then what about torture to state murder? Which is worse? How many tortured equals one state murder? So we have to figure out how and why and should we gather this data. Richard goes into more details about how measurement actually works regardless of the concept. So how is social science measurement different than other types of measures? And Richard talks about, look, we all can agree upon the metric system. We can all agree about what 10 centimeters means. But social scientists have to invent their measurements. So one person's perception and coding and definition of a particular concept might be different than someone else's. So there's not an agreed upon way to measure all these concepts in human rights. And then he talks about this concept of validity and reliability, and I'll go into more detail about that momentarily. And then he also talks about scope. Scope is just talking about the breadth of your topic. So human rights is a very huge topic. So we can't expect that there's going to be one measure to encapsulate all that we think about in terms of human rights. We have to think about different types of rights that we outlined last module. All right, so think about those types of things as we move forward. All right, so the study of international relations in general, which human rights is a part of. If we think about how have people gone about the study of international relations, we kind of have World War II as a traditional breaking point. So prior to World War II, there was a traditional approach to studying international relations. And it was the most common type of research that was done until the behavioral revolution in the 1950s and 60s. So prior to World War II, political science focused mainly on the study of institutions. How does the League of Nations work? How do different types of governments interact? So in a case study or in a comparative fashion, they looked at these institutions. There was also a focus on diplomatic concerns, which was usually tied to history. Public administration. Remember, Woodrow Wilson was a public administrator professor before coming into political office and being the President of the United States. So traditional political science emphasized historical, legalistic, and institutional subjects. The historical emphasis produced detailed descriptions of the developments leading to political events and practices. Legalism involved the study of constitutions and legal codes, while the concentration on institutions included studies on the powers and functions of political institutions such as legislatures, bureaucracies, courts. And so traditional political science focused on formal governments and their legally defined powers. And so traditional political science was primarily descriptive rather than explanatory because most of its practitioners did not feel a need to conduct research that had the characteristics of what we refer to as the hard sciences, like chemistry, for example. But after World War II, we have what is called the behavioral revolution. And World War II led many to become discontented with the field of political science and international relations, particularly in its inability to offer any predictions. The development of certain statistical techniques ushered in the behavioral revolution, the more scientific approach to the study of political science. So hopefully you would have taken the courses that we have as political science majors regarding statistics as well as research and writing that talk more about these types of statistical techniques. And so we generally have this notion or these key ideas about what we want social science to do because of the behavioral revolution. We want to have predictive value of our theories. We want a theory about war so that we can predict what conditions and when we might see war develop. So the theory should be testable. And how are you going to test theories? The behavioral revolution wanted to have quantifiable data. So we need to define what we mean by war and then be able to measure it. What do we mean by economic standing and be able to measure it? What do we mean by civil war and then be able to measure it? So we need to focus on behavior that is theoretically observable rather than subjective or normative that I talked about before. So we want theory-based ideas about how state relations work, and then we can derive hypotheses and then test those ideas. So the methodology is an important component of the research process. Issues that are studied should be important. They should be relevant. So social problems in today's world of poverty, human trafficking, things like that, and human rights. And we also are moving toward engaging in interdisciplinary pursuits. So there's a lot of overlay in the human rights field and international relations with history, with sociology, with economics. But of course, behavioral revolution has its critiques. Some people believe it's too ambitious, that the methodology became more important than the substantive results. The benefits, of course, is that it moved political science into a more scientifically rigorous direction. Okay, so continuing on this path of what happened after the behavioral revolution. Next came this idea of new institutionalism. This is the idea that institutions in the more traditional approach made a comeback. Remember, prior to World War II, the focus was on institutions, much to the neglect of the human element. And behavioralists moved in the opposite direction and maybe placed too much emphasis on human behavior to the neglect of institutions. So in the 60s and 70s, it was decided by those doing research that institutions do matter because they can provide a constraint to human and state behavior, and therefore these institutions must be considered. So while old institutionalism had a very narrow view of what constituted an institution, new institutionalism provided a wider net, so things like regime theory. And by regime here, I don't mean a bad or good regime like the Nazi regime, but a regime in international institutions talks about a set of norms and ideas and organizations around a topic. So we have the human rights regime that includes organizations like the UN, non-governmental organizations like like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, as well as individuals, as well as governments. And so that's one example of new institutionalism. Of course, we started to borrow from other fields like economics, where we get rational choice, or also known as public choice. So those who study international political economy, for example, would argue that you can't study politics without economics. Okay? So the key assumptions of a rational choice perspective is that individuals play a key role. So we have institutions playing a key role, states playing a key role, and now we have individuals play a key role. Individuals attempt to maximize utility. So you and I, on a daily basis, make these rational choice decisions. We may not sit there and write out the pros and cons and the utility each one of those gives us, but we make decisions based upon what's going to provide us with the best maximum utility. That is, what's to our best benefit? What's the cost versus the benefit? And a lot of rational choices applied to voting. Is it rational to vote? Do I get any benefit that outweighs the cost of voting, for example? And this helps to explain the free rider phenomenon in politics. Why should I go out there and use my time and money to engage in an activity where others are going to take care of it for me? Okay. So, of course, the knock on rational choice is that it relies on perfect information that's really not available in the social studies. So now political scientists tend to weigh their options between a case study versus a statistical approach, but we tend to find that we have them both in every field of political science, in particular human rights. We investigate these kinds of questions with both approaches to things like, why do some states engage in torture and other states don't? What are the conditions of human rights in certain countries? So we'll take a case study that will allow you to have a much more in-depth knowledge about a particular case. And then we'll also look at many cases that allow us to generalize about behavior in general. So those who study war, for example, there's human rights obviously attached to the study of war, but we might study a particular war, World War I, World War II, in depth to look at some of the characteristics and then draw conclusions and test hypotheses about whether or not these conditions apply to countries across the spectrum in a statistical analysis. All right, so let's look at how we study international politics. Where do we begin? The first place is really with a research question. So over here there would be this research question, and we could write it out there if we wanted to. So Poe and Tate in 1994 asked, why do some states abuse the personal integrity of their citizens and others don't? And you'll read a little bit of Poe and Tate later on. And Poe is one of the authors of the selections, I think it's 2.5 in your textbook. Stated another way, what are the conditions that lead to human rights violations? This is a question they ask in an article that's published in 1994. They come up with a theoretical argument and derive some hypotheses. Okay, so you have a research question and then a theory, and so they state a hypothesis right up here. So they might come up with the idea that democracies are less likely to violate rights than non-democracies. So governmental type or regime type matters. So that's a hypothesis. Democracies are less likely to violate rights than non-democracies. Why? So the why is the theory part, because, and I'm quoting them here, effective democracy provides citizens the tools to oust potentially abusive leaders from office before they are able to become a serious threat. The freedoms that are essential to procedural democracy may make it easier for citizens and opposition leaders to publicize attempts at repression. So that's part of their theoretical argument about their hypotheses that democracies are less likely to violate rights than non-democracies. So in order to test this theory, we need some data on levels of democracy and on human rights. Now, every time someone wants to study this phenomenon, are they going to have to go out and collect their own data on human rights and democracy? The answer today is no. At one point someone had to, but I will show you where a lot of this data is now available for you on the web, and you simply download it. So we need to get some data, and we'll do more about that later, and we test our hypothesis either through a case study or in a statistical analysis, and then we see if we confirm our hypothesis or if we have to reject our hypothesis, and then we might need to revise our theory and the process starts all over. We never really prove hypotheses or prove theories in the social sciences because we're dealing with a human element, and if you prove a theory or if you prove a hypothesis, then you have a law, and we don't have laws of human rights, so to speak, in terms of methodology. All right. So where do we get the data? All right, these are the basic ideas about measurement. So we have concepts versus variables. So these are some definitions that you'll need to kind of commit to memory. Conceptual or a nominal definition is simply referring to the meaning of a particular concept. So we have the concept of human rights, but as I mentioned, it's way too big. So let's just take the concept of personal integrity rights. This idea that states should not engage in behavior such as torture, disappearances, extrajudicial executions, things of that nature. So we're conceptually thinking about this idea of personal integrity is the idea that people have a right to their person, so to speak. So that's nominally what we mean, conceptually what we mean. We then have to operationalize that definition. We have to figure out how are we going to, what's the process by which that particular concept is measured. So we need to figure out, if we're looking at a country, how to rank a country, so to speak. So we have to figure out what we operationally mean so that a coder can go look at a country, the source documents we give them, and they can say, yes, this country rates a 3, this country rates a 2. So we have to have something that's operational. Then we're going to have the indicators. What are the specific observations made in order to measure a concept? So we might have a 5-point scale. Okay, the indicators of certain types of things you're asked on a survey. So if you do a survey online, it's least likely, likely, no opinion. So there's a scale on whether or not you're going to engage in some behavior. Okay, so we've moved into a variable. The variable is simply the measured concept. So this process of going from a concept of personal integrity, how we're going to measure that concept, to the actual indicators that make up the variable, this process is referred to as operationalization. All right, let's take a non-human rights example. Let's say we want to measure this thing called political trust. This is a concept that we want to look at in terms of whether or not people have political trust in government. Okay, so how are we going to go measure that? There's not a place where we go plug in people's thumbs into a meter that says, aha, their level of political trust is a 10. So conceptually, we want to think about what is the belief that officials are honest and competent. So if we're going to ask individuals on a survey, do you believe that officials are honest and competent, we have to tell them what their options are. All right, so we're trying to measure this concept, but it's very nebulous. It's not like counting money where we can say $10 is $10. This is a belief, an attitude. Okay, so operationally, we're going to have multiple questions with answers of 1 if you agree or 0 you disagree. So as a respondent, you're asked, do public officials, are they basically honest? If you agree, we'll code that a 1. If you disagree, we'll code that a 0. The second question, public officials have knowledge to do their job well. Do you agree with that or disagree with that? Most are crooks. Do you agree or disagree? And not really competent. 1, agree, 0, disagree. So you're asked these 4 questions. Okay. The indicator then is 0 to 4. You could have answered 0 on all this, or you could answer agree with all that. So it's 0 to 4 are your indicators by adding the number of trusting agrees for each question. Okay. So let's turn our attention to a human rights example. Again, we're going back to that political trust or security rights, personal integrity rights. So how are we going to conceptually talk about security rights? Again, think of this as the integrity of your person. Well, a gentleman, Gastile, came up with a 5-point, that's your indicators, ranking criteria, level A through B. I'm sorry, A through E. So level A, countries that live under a secure rule of law, people are not imprisoned for their views, torture is rare or exceptional. There might be prison brutality or police brutality, political murders are extremely rare, there's no detention without trial, and laws protect individual and group rights. And then you can see in B that basically what happens in A, but then we're going to add, there's a limited amount of imprisonment, few persons are affected, these things are not used to silence political opponents. Political murder is rare. You move to level C, there's an extensive political imprisonment or recent history of it. There's executions or other political murders. There's unlimited detention. In level D, you have level C, but it's expanded to larger numbers. You have murder, disappearances, torture, common. And basically the target are opponents. All right. On level E, what happens at level D is going on, but it's extended to the whole population. So basically level E is reserved for genocide, for example. So again, we have a concept of security rights. Each level describes increasing human rights violations. These are your definitional, your operational definitions. And this is what Gibney and Dalton talk about in their article 2.3 in your text. Okay. All right. So, how do we get this information? Well, what they do is they go to Amnesty International, the organization, and because Amnesty International every year goes and writes a report on the human rights conditions of all countries. So people will read through those documents and give these different level scores to that particular country. The State Department, the United States State Department, also writes an annual report on human rights, and so there's 2 source documents. So we determine the human rights score for each country from reading Amnesty International and State Department reports. And this is what I did in graduate school because I was a student of Dr. Steve Poe, who I mentioned earlier. So I would read Amnesty International reports in 1992 of Afghanistan and have to come up with what I thought that coding indicated. Okay. Well, we can easily convert these rankings that they have level A, level B, level C through E into some numbers. Okay. So these values are the indicators. So countries with a 5 would have the best human rights records, and the countries with 1 would have the worst. And this is what we refer to today as a political terror scale, and again, the Gibney and Dalton reading. And if you Google political terror scale, you will find that all this data, all this coding is available online for free. So the Gibney and Dalton selection guides you through this process of coding, including a discussion of the instructions and guidelines provided to each coder. Things like you should ignore your own biases, right? So whatever you think of the country of Sri Lanka shouldn't influence your coding. So you have to separate the normative attitudes out from the objective of coding a country based on the definition, the operational definition. What should you do if there's a benefit of the doubt? You tend to err on the side of being conservative. What do they say about the size of the country? Should this be a consideration? So again, if you have 10 political murders in a country that's really, really big in terms of population versus 10 political murders in a very small country, does this make a difference? And you should consider that. And then they talk about the differences between the source documents of Amnesty International versus the State Department. So what are the benefits of using Amnesty International? What are the concerns about using Amnesty International? And the same for the State Department. So be sure and look at that in the reading. Okay, we're going to take a break. This is part 1, and I'll continue with part 2 in the next lecture.